After lunch.
Maybe.
We're going to get started, folks.
There we go.
Thank you. We want to get you out here. I'm a teacher, so that's why.
Perfect. All right, so again, I'm Lauren. I'm a private practice attorney from Salt Lake, and I do quite a bit of fair housing work. Have the opportunity to prosecute 2 fair housing cases on the plaintiff's side, which has taught me a lot, but by a vast majority, my work is in defense. Sometimes I get the opportunity to teach my clients about the Fair Housing Act and give them some general counsel up front before they get in trouble. Most of the time, though, I'm answering a complaint and defending their situation. So hopefully I have some things to add to basically the same topics we've been discussing today. Some of it may be repetitive, so if your eyes glaze over, I will try to move on. I haven't used a PowerPoint in a very long time, so we're gonna try to remember to click it forward. That's me, of course. I'm not licensed in Idaho, just so you know. So really quickly, we've been patting this into you, but I just want to reiterate from my perspective why compliance is important. And you get it, you're here, it's a civil right, but most importantly, from my position, the phrase I like to tell my clients is that even if you win a fair housing case, you've lost. And part of the reason is that it's expensive. It's expensive to deal with. It takes your time. Sometimes you have to hire an attorney. You're not ever going to recoup your attorney's fees. That's considered retaliation under the Act. So the second that you get that complaint, if you're not able to resolve that in a mutual mediation type situation, man, it's going to hurt, and you've lost. So we want to avoid even getting there, and hopefully I can help in some ways. So we've discussed all the protected characteristics throughout the day. They're probably just blazoned into your brain, so I will skip past that. I will add in Utah, under our state act, sexual identity, gender identity, sexual orientation, and source of income are also protected. So we have a few additional in Utah. So what's up, Idaho? Come on. The topics that I wanted to discuss today that are impacted by the Fair Housing Act are the marketing, screening your potential residents, creating and enforcing your rules, considering requests for accommodation, which I know is a hot topic, training and hiring your staff, your policies, and everything you do. Everything you do is going to be impacted by the Fair Housing Act. So we will try to touch on everything. We've got a lot on our plate for this afternoon. I would like to hope that it would have been harder to find really blatant discriminatory advertisements online, but it was just too easy. So the big keys in advertising your rental properties, you need to be advertising based on the characteristics of your unit or your home that you're putting out there, not the tenants you want. So this is, no kids, no blacks, no Latinos. This is problematic, right? This is going to land you in trouble every time. Pet friendly, but no Section 8 or minorities. This is going to be a problem. So when you're putting your marketing out there, it's good to put your fair housing logo, to put your fair housing statement, that you don't discriminate based on any of the protected characteristics. And also, in this day and age, most everybody has to have a website, probably, unless you've got a pretty small community. Maybe some of the college student rental properties don't have a website, but put your non-discrimination policies up there, and put your criteria for what you're looking for in the residents. Your rent, your credit, requirements, all of that kind of stuff. Just put it out there. It doesn't need to be a secret, and in fact, keeping it a secret is what will land you in trouble later. The other thing that I want to add is that, sorry, some of these I tried to do cutesy stuff and make it fly in, and then I got tired and stopped doing that at some point, so just hang with me. If you're going to put photos up, make sure that they are diverse. and include families, include children, include, people with disabilities, because, we've talked about before, if you have a photo of a bunch of, the characters from Mad Men, it's probably not going to look too welcoming. But also, make sure you have written permission to put those photos up, especially the guardians of children. That is a whole other mess you don't need. When you're going through and screening your prospective residents, we've talked about all of the characteristics that you want. You don't want somebody who's going to leave you a mess. You don't want somebody who's going to run out, not pay the rent. You want somebody who's been a good tenant before. So I think that, if you have all of those lists of things and you're going to check the box and apply them to everybody, that's what you should be doing. You should put it up, make it available. When somebody wants a lease application, let them know what your qualifications are. Sorry, I don't usually speak in front of this many people. I'm so nervous.
Doing great.
I can heckle back there just fine, but up here it's a whole different world.
My turn to heckle now.
Great job, Lauren.
So, I just think that there's no reason not to share the criteria. And more often than not, if you're being really upfront with your requirements, people who know that they can't qualify are going to start looking somewhere else. It's when you haven't brought that up and they think that they might have a chance, and then at the very end you go, well, I don't think you have the credit. It starts to look suspicious, especially if you come from a background where discrimination is part of your everyday life. It's going to be a little bit fishier when you get rejected based on criteria you didn't know existed ahead of time. So, the other thing to remember is, as Mike talked about earlier, your screening policy is still going to be subject to the Fair Housing Act. So, if you need to give a reasonable accommodation to somebody, even if you could be renting to somebody else and this person needs an assistance animal, you need to make that happen. Providing alternative criteria for credit or income, those people that are on Social Security disability income and it's, very limited, or people who don't have the most stellar record. A lot of times in Salt Lake, we have a pretty big refugee community. My neighbors two doors down are refugees from Sudan. They've lived in our neighborhood longer than I have, and I've lived there like 10 years. So, they're very dependable and great, but when it came to getting credit references and everything else, they really relied on their community to bolster them as reliable, good, and dependable tenants. So I think that you can really utilize some of the community criteria you have here, especially with ISU. The other thing is remember with children. So if you have a one-bedroom house and you have a couple with a baby, it's probably going to land you in trouble if you tell them they need to have a two-bedroom place. Now, if you have a one-bedroom apartment and a couple shows up with their 17-year-old and they want to rent it, you're probably going to be okay to deny that based on, the size of the unit. But it is something that you just kind of have to balance based on the size of the family, how old the kids are, etc.
Lauren, can I share something really quick?
Absolutely.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Just remember there's a HUD issued a long time ago, the Keating memo, and in it takes into consideration the factors that Lauren, HUD usually goes 2 people per bedroom, and then all these factors that Lauren just suggested. So make sure that if you look at the square footage and other rooms that could be used as a bedroom in making your decision, and not children under 2, and more broadly right now we're even seeing policies where not children under 5. So they're not counted as a person. So I say that with you because in the Ninth Circuit there have been, at least with some of the California large housing providers, their attorney who actually works for housing providers has said that they have expanded only because it's been litigated so often in that area. So.
Yeah, and your city fire code may allow a lot more people per square feet than you think. It depends on what city you're in. In Boise, I know you can have something like 1 person every 150 square feet, which, it seems like a pretty tight squeeze, but on the other hand, if that's what you can afford, then maybe that's what you're looking for.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And people are embracing minimalist living in tiny spaces and no deodorant. I don't know. I couldn't live in that small of a space with anyone, let alone myself. That would be very hard for me.
If I'm going to be one person every 150 square feet, I'm going to want deodorant.
The other part of the practice that I would like to, see more routinely is date and time stamping the applications when you receive them. This is part of the overarching theme of documentation that all of these fine people have been, trying to reiterate all day, and I'm just gonna hammer home till you get it. You have to document because it's gonna save you in the end. Unless it doesn't, then you just burn it. I'm just kidding. I'm sorry, I think I'm funny. Make sure you're reviewing those applications then in the order that you receive them, and offer available units in the order that you've received the applications. There are some problems with this, right? This kind of first come, first served policy does in some ways disadvantage single parents, disabled, elderly, but at this point, for best practices for you, coming from Defense Counsel, this is the best way to protect yourself, and the burden isn't on you quite yet to institute a lottery system or something else.
HUD had, as of January 23rd here in Idaho anyways, we now have a coordinated entry system to where they are put on a queue by prioritization. What does that do for serving who comes in first? Because we have to pull from the queue on how they're prioritized on that queue.
So your question is about the HUD instituted prioritization system and my offer of a housing tip, and I'll probably refer to these guys up here because, to be honest, I don't deal with federally funded houses or Section 8. I pretty much exclusively represent property managers and homeowners associations and condos, but I would think that if you're doing what HUD's telling you to do, that's probably your safest bet.
Yeah. So the question about coordinated entry is for the system for getting people out of homelessness, and HUD does, so our housing authorities that are implementing this program have adopted prioritization systems. And it's not, we are still in very early days in figuring out what kind of prioritization system is going to be acceptable. HUD has in the past not objected to certain prioritization systems, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they will be okay. IFHC is concerned that some prioritization systems are, they're well-intentioned by trying to say, so-and-so is most vulnerable because they have this disability, but if they're following that prioritization system, it may mean that they're asking a lot of questions about the nature and severity of somebody's disability, which you aren't normally allowed to do. So sadly, we're in the Wild West here, and it will probably be a few years before we can give a definitive answer on what a coordinated entry system ought to look like.
And just so we have had discussions both with Idaho Housing and Finance and with City of Boise has its own continuum care. And so we're having those discussions about what you can ask and what you can't ask. And, we just HUD had a fair housing training. I won't speak for what HUD says, but someone called in and they described a situation where they were doing developed a transitional housing, an SRO, and can it be for one gender? Can it be, what's the occupancy policy? And if you get a chance, you should watch what the HUD GTR, the technical representative, said, because it would not be what maybe was intended. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but my understanding of what her response was that you shouldn't be selecting based on gender. You shouldn't be selecting, you shouldn't limit it to, be more expansive than just that one person. Maybe it'll be a baby, maybe it will be another individual. Maybe it'll be that person's care provider. So there are things where we thought it would go one way, maybe, or maybe the program was hoping it would go one way, and then there were all these other complications that came up. And so I think when in doubt, whether you're a housing provider or a property manager or trying to get an individual into one of these programs, is that you contact us, contact HUD, call Lauren, get some help, because that's how you get the best information on a case-by-case basis. So that's my opinion. I think you should get the help you need proactively.
Yeah, there's a couple of GAO reports out under government review of their office there, and I don't have the numbers now, but I came across them, and it's talking about the fact that they need linkages to the communities with defining those aspects of housing that's goodly consistent with the policy that you have, and look at the federal regs when you're developing the policy.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not quite sure if I could paraphrase that. I should have given you the microphone. That was very well spoken. Does anybody else have anything on screening or advertising? No? Perfect. This is my favorite thing to do. No, I'm just kidding. So creating and drafting rules is so important. And I don't care if you're an HOA or an apartment complex. This is going to be your next challenge and your next potential liability. So for starters, every community needs to have a set of written rules, and in line with what Mike said, it needs to not discriminate against particular people. It needs to be behavior focused, but it also needs to keep in mind that there are some people who exhibit particular behaviors, like small children being loud. So, just keep that in mind. If you're going to have a rule banning, noise in a common area, you're going to have a real problem with little kids when it gets beautiful like it is today and they're outside playing, if you're going to try to enforce that against people with children. The other part of the rule policy is that you need an enforcement policy, and I think Zoe called it
a progressive discipline.
Progressive discipline. You need some mechanism by which to enforce your rules and to be able to get rid of bad tenants before they leave you in a lurch. I think you need to make sure it's applicable to everybody, and I would always start with a written warning. After that, start moving into fining. Depending on what kind of community you are, you can get up to an injunction lawsuit or an eviction, something, and that really should be well down the way. But you need to have some sort of escalating mechanism to enforce your rules. Not too many rules. We don't need 25 pages of rules. Rules that you're actually going to enforce, not rules that sounded good at 3 in the morning when you wrote them, but really, really good rules to protect your tenants and to protect your property.
And rules that you're going to enforce equally.
Always. So when you are, like Zoe said, we are going to uniformly enforce your rules against all of your residents every time. It needs to be, a system. One feature of these systems that can be really nice is to have a sort of appeals system where, if somebody has, again, not put the trash in the can, they've just left it in front of the dumpster, and now it's your problem, so you're issuing them that $25 fine. They can appeal, give it 14 days. They can say, hey, can you hear me out on this? And they can say, look, I sprained my arm and I had the kid in one arm and I couldn't lift the trash can, and maybe you can waive that fine based on some circumstances. But that needs to be something that they can show, but you can also show that you've been instituting and enforcing your rules and your fines evenly against all of your residents. The other thing that I think is really important, and this especially comes up with neighbor disputes, is corroborating evidence. So I'm going to tell you what I think is a funny story. So I have a condominium association client, and there are two neighbors who hate each other, like Cain and Abel. They just hate each other. And in one unit is a gentleman who smokes inside, and they own it. They can. Nothing I can do about that. And his significant other, who has some mental conditions that cause her to yell out some nasty things sometimes. And on the other side is a very nice, quiet, older couple. And the smoke drives them nuts, and hearing, swear words screamed out at 3 a.m. drives them nuts. And they can't stand each other, they can't get along. And it's been like 7 years in the making. Well, our very quiet couple lately, a few months ago, took to calling the police. And the police would come out and not be able to verify anything. So she took to calling the property manager and demanding that he issue fines. Well, they would try to go verify the smell of the smoke or hear the screaming and couldn't ever verify anything. And lo and behold, there was a fair housing complaint filed based on harassment. And the requiring corroborating evidence, I think, is going to be a big deal. I don't think that as the owner or the property manager, you need to corroborate yourself. But if you're going to take in complaints from residents, I think it's a really good idea to try to investigate to see what's going on. Just like calling the dog catcher on the neighbor, do some investigation there and see whether those disputes really have a legitimate underlying cause. And then keep detailed records. And this is so important. We recently had a case where a gentleman refused to landscape his front yard, which is required. It was just a big dirt pile. It was looking terrible. It had been a couple of years since he bought the house, and it was the neighbors were just done with it. And so the community started to issue their escalating fines to try to get this gentleman to landscape his lot, get the neighborhood looking the way it should. And lo and behold, one day, we opened the mail to find an FHA complaint alleging that the fines had been issued based on his national origin. And luckily, the client kept every fine issued. And all we had to do was take a stack to HUD and say, here you go. Here's the same time period, same kind of fines issued to everyone. And that's, really what the record keeping is for. It's really just a CYA, if I can say that on YouTube. So this harassment is really the key reason that I think these rules are going to be so important for everybody to have written. It was September of 2016, I think, that HUD came out with this new regulation banning a couple types of harassment, and one of them is hostile environment harassment. So this is Marcia Wetzel, and she lives in a community, 55 and older community in Illinois. Well, she moved in right after her partner of 30 years had passed away, and pretty quickly after she moved in, kind of the rumor mill started about her sexual orientation, names started getting called, and before long, someone would ram her while she was on her motorized scooter. Someone spit on her when she was in the elevator. Someone tipped over the table while she was in the dining hall eating, all coupled with some pretty offensive name calling. And it really did impact her to the point where she stopped going to the dining hall to eat. She started eating alone in her unit. It really affected her. And when she went to the property management company, they said what I used to tell my clients to say: we don't get involved in neighbor disputes. That's between you. If your neighbor is being a jerk, you need to call the police. If they're being loud, you need to call the police. This is not what we do. Guess what? That's what we do now. So welcome to the new world, because it's on you. It really is. When you have noticed that you've got this kind of behavior, harassment based on a protected characteristic, the onus is now on the landlord, the housing provider, to step up and get involved. And this is where those rules and enforcement policies start to take effect. Not only can you show that you've been trying to stop this harassment, but you have a mechanism to end it altogether eventually. You know, you escalate that enforcement up all the way and get them out, you know. We typically have nuisance provisions in a lot of our documents, a lot of lease provisions. I don't love the nuisance rules because there's so much discretion there. They can be applied, you know, unequally throughout the community, but it is at least a safety net to start for this kind of behavior, because it's not easy to regulate free speech. It's not easy. I'm not sure I would, you know, ban a Confederate flag in a window just based on the political speech aspect, but you know, can't be cross burning. There's not, you know, there can't be spitting, and there can't be ramming people's motorized wheelchairs. It's a fine line to walk, and you know, you guys are all brave souls for walking it. But this is where we're going. In fact, the HUD regulation says that it doesn't even have to be physical contact. All sorts of conduct are gonna fall under this rule, and even one instance can be enough in the right circumstances to qualify as hostile environment harassment. So it's coming. I've already had a couple of cases with it, and it's tough. It really is tough. So as part of this is where your rules come in. This is where applying them, keeping the enforcement, keeping the records, and investigate. When people bring complaints to you about their neighbors, look into it, because you can't throw your hands up and let people figure it out anymore. The judge in Marsha Wetzel's case, he initially ruled against her, and it went up on appeal, and the Seventh Circuit of Appeals said, you know, housing providers aren't allowed to just shrug their shoulders anymore. It's just, you know, can't just be, well, it's crabby old neighbors, what are you gonna do? So, now, I know that emotional support animals and assistance animals are very sensitive, so this is my nephew. He's 3, holding a therapy kangaroo. And if you can't love that, I don't know what's wrong with you. This is by far, I think, the hottest topic. And, you know, again, I will just say, you know, when you lose, you really lose. And when you win, you still lose. Financially, with your reputation, it gets tough. So think very hard about whether the emotional support animal and the assistance animal battle is something you really want to have. Because if you have it, you do it right, it's going to be expensive, and 99.9% of the time you're still going to lose. So I'm positive we'll have a ton of questions, but you know, we always just tell our housing providers to look for 3 things. They need to be disabled within the meaning of the act. The accommodation needs to be reasonable. So no aggressive dogs, that's just not reasonable. And the accommodation needs to be necessary. And there are various definitions of this throughout the country, but really necessary, I think, means it needs to alleviate a symptom or symptoms of that disability in a way that makes that dwelling, you know, more usable, more enjoyable for the individual who's living there. Yeah?
Yeah.
You're not doing much heckling, so.
We're honoring you because it's your turn.
I just got him scared, that's all.
I will get my revenge.
So one part of the accommodation, you know, feature of the Fair Housing Act that I think goes just too ignored is recognizing when someone has made a request. There are no magic words. There are no formal requirements. I really get nervous about forms, and simply because you're not allowed to ask information that you don't need, which includes information you already know. So if you have somebody and you know that they have a disability, maybe they're wanting to change their accommodation, different animal, or maybe they're in a wheelchair and they need a ramp and you can see that, but the guy running the front office goes, well, here's this form I found in the file cabinet, just fill that out and get it back to us and then we can process your request for the ramp. This is a problem. People stop thinking really critically and analyzing what they know and what they need to know when they rely on forms. The other thing is that a form gets stuck in a drawer and the law changes and the form comes out and you're in trouble, just like that. I do get very nervous about forms. I think it's a good idea to use them internally. I think that, Intermountain Fair Housing Council has great forms on their website. I just might not always put them out there on the resident to fill out. Maybe fill them out, when they bring you that information. The other thing is you can't require anybody to fill out a form. They can have anybody else fill it out for them or anybody else make the request. So just be so very cautious because it's not a battle you want to fight. It really isn't. Yes.
So if you're not using forms and you're not necessarily required, documenting then will make sense, and it's supported by the fact that, well, we don't use forms, but we document everything. So that means whatever you put down is the way you saw it, doesn't necessarily mean it comes from the other end, does it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the issue is that if you're not getting the information, the written information straight from the resident, that you're putting your own spin on things. That or that potential
basically,
is there.
Yeah.
And I understand that concern, and I would say that really your internal form should be verified disability within the meaning of the act. Check. Is it necessary? Verified? Check. Is it reasonable? I'll jump forward. I was going to talk about this a little bit later, but there are a lot of requirements about record keeping, and I don't know specifically what will be applicable to each of you, but for instance, in Utah, every nonprofit corporation, every record they keep, any member of that nonprofit corporation can request every record at any time. And all the nonprofit corporation can redact is social security numbers, bank account numbers, and attorney-client privilege information. Which means every nonprofit, or every HOA and condo association in Utah, and it's the same in Idaho, is a nonprofit corporation. So if they are keeping people's disability verification letters, something that says, my child has anxiety and needs a cat, that is in their records, and any member of the HOA can request that information and they're entitled to it under the Act, which is a big problem. I don't necessarily think anybody really wants people's private disability information hanging out in their file cabinets anyway. So once you've verified it, but what do you really need it for? It puts a new level of liability on you to keep that kind of information when what you need to analyze the accommodation is very limited. And then what you need is to issue a written grant of accommodation, something that says, hey, you met all the requirements of the Fair Housing Act, here's your accommodation, and maybe there are some rules that are associated with that accommodation. Like if your cat's gonna leave the building, you're gonna put it in a carrier, right? Somebody was discussing with me earlier about the changing of the animal, mid-accommodation and not informing the housing provider, which turns out to be a big problem because the animal's kind of scary and it freaked out, the maintenance guy when he went to walk in and was not expecting that. I don't think it would be unreasonable in your grant of accommodation to say, hey, if your accommodation needs change, let us know. You don't even necessarily have to check all those boxes again. They've met the disability. So you definitely don't want to be handing them out that form again and saying, okay, well, go have your provider tell us that you're disabled again. You just need that kind of need and necessary, portion verified. again.
Yeah, like I have seen some housing provider attorneys recommend saying, well, you should go back and redo this verification every so many days. It's like, well, what led you to believe that their disability would wear off? And how much of an idiot are you going to feel like presenting that to somebody who is in a wheelchair and saying, hey, come back in a year if your legs work again? It's like, come on.
Yeah.
Although I would say, in some cases, an accommodation that was established 10 years prior will have the means to accommodate that person will have evolved over time to this point, and then they do have to be revisited. So once again, to underscore your point is that if you have the documentation for that, you're covered as a provider.
Would it be appropriate when you renew a lease to review whether their accommodation needs have changed? Just to ask that question?
That depends on the circumstances under which you're doing it. The existence of the disability is probably not going to change unless you got some notice at the beginning saying that this was temporary. I've just had surgery and I only need this for such and such a period of time. I would be okay with saying if your accommodation needs have changed, please contact the office. If you make it a mandatory you must recertify or else thing, then I'm going to start to get mad.
And I'm not saying recertify, simply during the lease renewal process, ask the question, have your accommodation needs changed, and if so, how?
Yeah, I would.
Because then you can offer further accommodation.
Yeah, I would more likely do that as if your needs have changed, contact the office.
Yeah, I think so too.
Okay, we've got a question.
Well, I think it's important to remember when we're talking about disability, there's a lot of different things that can come in different contexts and different laws. And so where the Social Security Administration might reevaluate how disability is defined for that program, that's not really the same process that is involved in evaluating what a disability is under the Fair Housing Act or under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so, you might see yourself in a position, well, I'm just doing what the Social Security Administration is. You're not. You're doing something completely different. You should not be conflating those two programs together and kind of putting on your lawyer hat without your law degree and going for it.
And I'm actually thinking more along the lines of like the emotional support animals, that kind of issue, not someone in a wheelchair.
So, yes.
This is just the accommodation. They're asking that question. Has your accommodations changed? I have a lot of elderly and handicapped, and you'd be amazed at their yearly annual, how many of them request a handicapped toilet. Okay, so it's not just asking the handicapped, it's asking any of them, is there any maintenance issues or accommodations we can help you with? So I don't know how our office asks that question. All I know is I put in a lot of handicapped toilets today. Okay, so they're asking them, is there anything we can do to help accommodate you, or So I think it's across the board on ours, because that question to me did not even have anything to do with a reasonable accommodation or handicap. That just was a maintenance question to me. So I don't.
Yeah.
Well, there's a problem too of perception of somebody's disability, is that you don't want to operate on the assumption that, well, there's something wrong with that guy, or something, and you got to be so careful. That's why it's a dicey thing. I suppose the simpler the question, if you're going to do that, the better. But it does open some worm cans, if I may put it that way.
Yeah, and
I can see that.
Yeah, and the idea of just making it so that it's not a pain for residents to deal with you if they need a situation is going to encourage them to come forward rather than covering things up. And where I can go into a slight tangent about how for a while there were apartment complexes who were looking on Trulia and saying, oh boy, they're saying that we're a high crime area because we're getting a lot of police calls here. So the way we're going to fix this is we are going to evict anybody if the police come to your residence. And then they can come and say, hey, look, the crime problem is gone. It's like, no, the crimes were still happening. People were just afraid to call the cops. So now every domestic violence victim who lives in these apartments is suffering in silence. But good job. You look better on Trulia.
Can't do that.
Yeah.
And HUD issued guidance on that to not do that anymore, especially because it disproportionately affects not only women, but also people of color. And so, they already said that you can't do that. So I think that's important. I think it's important to have a statement that makes it inviting, a little bit more like you were saying, say it to everyone, so when they come, that you welcome accommodation requests. I think that's helpful, so that they know you're a fair housing partner with them, and that they can come to you with their needs. And I agree also with Rick that you don't want to assume they need something that causes you to say, oh, well, I'm going to put you in the first floor apartment because obviously you have a personal disability, you need that. And they may say, oh, I'm offended, I'm going to file a fair housing complaint because I want the second floor because I have MS and I want to go be able to use my therapeutic exercises going to the second floor. So
an open door for communication for maintenance.
Exactly.
We have to do an annual inspection once a year of all the apartments. And so they go in, and you know what, we miss the office people that do these inspections miss things. As maintenance, we go in and do their work order, and we're like, geez, how'd they miss that, Because they always get the battery for the smoke detector, but the sink's leaking underneath. How'd they miss that, It's just a different set of eyes. So we always ask the tenant, hey, is there anything you need?
Yeah.
So we use it as a communication tool. So I thought of that question completely
differently.
irrelevant to who you are. I'd be asking everybody. At least I do. Maybe I better change my wording. I don't know. As I enter the apartment.
I think it's important to give everyone the opportunity to ask for an accommodation and not just on if they've already asked for one. So I think that's good to have a policy of, just make sure as a maintenance person, he's doing the right thing, is that if you're maintenance or some other employee, that once you've heard them say, yeah, I need that toilet, I'm sure you put it in, but make sure you document it. You go to your person and say, and you can talk on this, Lauren, how you advise your clients, but make sure you document, hey, we have to put in a raised toilet, they've requested it, it's a de minimis cost, or someone's paying for it, and just make sure you document, because that is a reasonable accommodation request. There's no magic words. They just said, I need the raised toilet. If they didn't say I need a reasonable accommodation, they meant not know.
We do a lot of that.
Yeah.
I get automatic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, I think that customer friendly, is there anything we could do for you, is fine. What we want to make sure you stay away from is making them recertify that they have a disability, right? Hey, it's been 3 years. I see you still have Rover here. What's the deal?
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, once you've verified that disability from reliable information, the real concern becomes, do you know what accommodation is still existing? And, maybe the problem is that, you made an accommodation for, Jasper, the Maltese poodle there, and Jasper's passed away, and now you have a new dog. Now there's a dog in the community, and you don't know who it belongs to. I think as a housing provider, you have a right to know what accommodation you've made, which is why I think in your grant letters, you just welcome that opportunity. And to be on the opposite side, but saying the same thing as Zoe, I just had a parking space accommodation request that took 6 months to grant. And you know what? Nobody got sued. So, and the whole point is that, the parking lot became a whole disaster about who even owned the parking lot and who could grant an accommodation, because there were a whole bunch of disasters, and the developer who, put the project together really quick, and then the recession hit and he left everything half done, and it was a disaster, and we didn't even know how to grant an accommodation. It became a really big deal. But communicating that with the other side, they totally understood. And, we figured it out, and no feelings were hurt. So really entering into that dialogue and that interactive process is going to be a really safe harbor for you, not just in protecting from liability under the Act, but avoiding a complaint in the first place. So there's that. The last thing with requests, I talked about issuing that written grant letter. I do think that's something you keep in your file. Then, whoever comes in next to, manage that building or do anything else can look, see that you've made that accommodation grant, and you don't need to keep the disability verification letters or the things that might put you at risk, things that you really don't want to keep around. The other part of processing these is to do it quickly. If you delay too long, you can be considered to have constructively denied the request. There is a case currently pending where a condo board and a director have been sued for wrongful death because they delayed an emotional support animal decision for so long, and the resident ended up committing suicide. And the family has now sued the property manager, the board of directors, everybody for wrongful death. And it's just not a position you want to be in. It's not a position your insurance company wants to step up to defend you in. It's, no matter what happens, again, nobody wins, everybody loses in that situation. So it really does get very critical just to reduce your liability, to move pretty quickly. And then just communicate, engage in the interactive process. If you let people know what your hangups are, what the obstacles are, hey, I'd love to grab, give you this parking space, but I don't even know who owns this parking lot. It's going to take me a little bit. All of these things, people are pretty understanding when you engage in that dialogue and you don't keep it too close to the vest. It's when I have clients who don't want to communicate with their residents and tell them why they have concerns, that's when we land into hot water. So I would just use that interactive process. It really does help you. All right, promised I would talk about online assistance animal letters. So I had a client got a request for an accommodation for an emotional support animal, and the sequence of events and some other things caused the client to be a little concerned, a little suspicious. So they, sent the letter over and said, "What do you think of this?" And on the second page of Google, as I was playing around, I found this letter right here on the left. And it looked a lot like the letter I had received. So I did a little more searching and I found a site called Recertification. And I spent $200. For another $30, I could have gotten an airline accommodation verification. And I got the letter on the right. That's me, that's my fake name. This is a problem. I know the answers that I put in to the system to get the letter. And I had a phone call with the therapist who did not ask me about my symptoms, did not ask me about my feelings, did not ask me a thing. It was really concerning. And I can say this, standing here as somebody who, my dad is a disabled vet. He has a legitimate emotional support animal. That dog, is his world. But this doesn't help anybody. So when you see these sorts of letters that are very, pro forma, they don't look legitimate, this is when you need to be reaching back out and asking for, more information. I have some questions, some concerns about the reliability of this letter. What else can we talk about? And it's a fine line, and maybe it's time to get some of your fair housing partners involved in that conversation. But these are what are popping up everywhere. I know Delta has recently started pushing back. They're gonna be really hard-nosed about it now. American Airlines, I think, has gone this way. But these are not legitimate. Neither are the letters that certify an animal as an emotional support animal. That's not a thing. Nor does an emotional support animal need a vest or any other kind of marker. So these are things to watch for.
I don't understand. How can you tell that's not a real letter?
So neither one of these are the letters that I got, by the way. These are not anybody's letters except for the news and mine. But there had been some circumstances with this particular individual and some requests made that didn't add up, some previous attempts at verification that had not met that level. And one of them was certifying the animal as an emotional support animal. And so we came back and said, we need some verification about the disability, not so much the animal, but your disability. And so eventually we got this, and the signature is typed, the logo is kind of just nondescript medical. The individual was not from Utah. If you look at the sentences, many of them, I know you can't see them, but if you were to look at them closely, many of them aren't grammatically correct. They don't make sense if you read them out loud, so they're just kind of computer generated. So all of these things start to add up, and it just happened to be that I clicked onto the second page of Google, which never happens. I always find what I need on the first page, so wonder of wonders that a local Florida news channel had done a story and posted the letter on the left, and I did the same site and came up with the letter on the left, and we had to push back for more verification. And I know I've heard some people talk about calling the doctors or calling the providers.
Not doing it.
I don't
say
ever
not
do it.
to do
Yeah,
it.
yeah, don't. Okay, people out there in the world talk about it. Don't do it. Don't do it. If you need more information, ask your resident for more information. Explain why you need it. Be really specific. Don't be broad. But yeah, don't call the doctor.
And I think too, when you hear someone, we've had people come in and say, well, my dog's a registered service animal. I'm like, well, that's not necessary under the Fair Housing Act. So that's not a required thing. So what I'm going to ask you to do is, if they're asking you to get a proof of need, that's what you need to do. And then we go through and explain that. But I'm like, you shouldn't have paid for something that you didn't need because it's not necessary. I think that's an educational opportunity there to have that, so they're not spending money on something that they don't need to live at some place. And I don't know who told them that, but they don't need it.
Yeah,
so.
well, they looked it up on Google, and the people trying to sell them stuff got the first results.
Yeah.
Although that said, even though you don't need a vest for an ESA, a lot of people still go and get them because they're sick of answering questions.
Yeah.
They just say, look at the dang vest.
Well, and sometimes the ESAs are getting taken to places that probably normally you wouldn't see an ESA.
Yeah.
That service dogs would be permitted at, but not ESAs.
And a lot of people don't understand the difference because everyone in the world should be here today learning. We would need a bigger venue, though.
So when you're saying
YouTube.
ask for more clarification, what should we ask for? I mean, and so I go to my tenant and I say, you know what, I need a little bit more clarification, but I can't really push them. So how far do I go before I'm in trouble?
It absolutely depends on what you're needing clarification of, but if it's the existence of a disability, in this circumstance, we were able to point to a succession of events and say all of this together leads to, this being unreliable. So if you could provide something from, someone, you've moved here 8 months ago, do you have a provider here, that you see? Is there, somebody at...
So you can ask for, I need a letter from a local provider? Is that...
Not necessarily. I'm so sorry. This is the worst thing we do to you. We're like, give you advice and then say, it depends. I can't give you any advice. I empathize and I'm sorry, but I'm doing that to you again. So again, I will be honest, if I had seen this letter first and there had not been the previous succession of events, I would have told my client to grant the accommodation without any further questions. That's the real case of it. There are a whole other set of events that happened first that led us to that point and led me to having, numerous letters that look almost the same. Again, it's the battle you want to fight. And with emotional support animals, you really need to decide whether that's the battleground you want to go to, and you don't want to be invading in people's privacy, but as a practical matter, chances are it's an accommodation that needs to be made. So
on emotional support animals, they have to prove they were trained somehow?
No, that would be a service dog. So a service dog, which can go anywhere, restaurants and grocery stores, and should be marked, should have a vest or something. Seeing eye dog, a dog that can turn on switches, a dog that can detect seizures, that'll be a service dog. Those are trained. An emotional support animal can be a peacock, it can be a yak, it can be an untrained poodle. They should be trained. We would all wish they'd be trained, but speaking, because I have bad dogs, I have terrible dogs, so I can say that.
But she's just saying, they don't have to be trained under the Fair Housing Act. They can be individually trained. They don't have to be professionally trained, any size breed, any of those things. I think the important thing, also getting back to what she was asking, is if you get something and it seems questionable, go back to the tenant and say, I'm having concerns. I'm a fair housing provider. I'm granting this, but could you go, and it may be they come back and say, well, my physician, I go see someone in the Mayo Clinic in whatever state. Can I get that person? You're like, of course you can. I can't inquire the nature and severity, and I don't want to know where. Just bring that verification into me. I think sometimes, like what she was saying, is there are red flags when something, now just mind you, we're not all perfect, as you can see. We miss typos or things. That's my fault too, because I looked at it. But there are things you look at it and go, there's something not right. This looks like a form letter, or there aren't grammatical, something looks wrong. Or one housing provider showed me a letter that they had received, and I looked at it and said, I would have just said to them, I'm a fair housing provider. Can you please make sure that you go and get something that maybe verifies that they have a disability under the Fair Housing Act, not what it is, because what they had said in the letter did not say that. Didn't say that it was necessary, that they needed it, or whatever that's the synonym for necessary. And those are the kinds of things where you can have that interaction. If you need help, you should get suggestions from HUD. You can contact. We have housing providers that contact us. You can contact Lauren. You can contact the Human Rights Commission. There are resources to help you problem solve it, so you don't have that. And I think some of you will have supervisors that have done this for years and years and years that are great resources. So there's that question.
Yeah.
This morning you said something about it should be a letter from someone who is familiar with the disability, reliable, familiar.
A reliable third party in a position to know.
Reliable third party.
Yeah, so a documentation that you would submit on something like this would be, here is why I have darn good reason to believe why the person who filled out this proof of need is not a reliable third party who is in a position to know, because blah, 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 blah. I saw one guy once at training say, well, I suspected this because the letter came from a Pacific Island Pacific Island medical provider for a Pacific Islander, and I know how Pacific Islanders are, and they're always doing this sort of stuff, and I nearly leapt out of my seat, and if those Pacific Islanders had come to me, I would have gone to that person's office with the sledgehammer of justice and made them pay for it. But none of you would do that.
So, because that was also what protected status were they discriminating against? National origin, yeah. So not only disability, national origin, but to your end, some of this stuff is not like things it's the geniuses of HUD. The HUD DOJ guidance actually has that wording in it. And so when we look to reference, we look at, case law, we look at federal law, and the gratefulness that you have of some of your state law protections and city ordinances. But that language is specifically stated in the HUD DOJ guidance on reasonable accommodations and modifications.
A good phrase to put your mind where it needs to go.
Yep. That's right.
Yeah, I mean, there are a scope of, people, the mom that has, taken their child to all of the specialist appointments and knows all of those limitations better than any doctor ever could, is probably the best person to verify disability and the need for whatever accommodation that, child needs. Really is. But in this situation, and the way places like Recertification and Dog Tour get around that is they set up a phone call. So they are supposed to call you and have that interaction so that now they have some concept of, you and your symptoms. This is after you've filled out a very long form of yes, no, and really weird scale questions, like on a scale of 1 to 7, I'm not happier than I feel like I was in the last 2 weeks. Like, just very strangely worded. I mean, there were like 3 attorneys in my office going through this form, like, I don't understand what is going on here. So,
You have to watch out for moms, though. I had a mom come and say, I'll pay you the first and last month's rent and the deposit and whatever else you need if you let my son rent from you. And within a month, he totally trashed the place.
yeah, but we have doctors who are happy to write you, Percocet prescriptions when you don't need them. So the thing is it just, that's the state of the law. So it's a sensitive topic, but doctors are just as likely to give you whatever you want as your mom. Sometimes more often, financial incentives. So, all right, are we done on emotional support animals, or do we need to vent some more? We could have like a support for dealing with emotional support animals. All right, so all of this kind of culminates in staff training. And again, written policy, I know. And policies are terrible to write. Like, they're the worst, and it's annoying. You have to think about it, and I'm just sorry. You should just do it. Just bust it down, do it. And it doesn't have to be long. In fact, the shorter the better, because if you stick to it, the better off you are. Review it, figure out what's working, what's not working, and change it. It can be adaptable, but when it's in writing and you can say, well, this is version 12 and I, changed it on this date, this is the one that was in effect when this issue happened, you're gonna be so much better off. The other part is you bring on new, staff, new personnel, walk through the process of those housing decisions, from reviewing an application to reviewing, an accommodation request, reviewing complaints, that whether they need to be, fined or not, these kinds of situations. You're getting an update tomorrow, whoever this belongs to. There are just so many scenarios. Every time everybody says case-by-case basis, this is the kind of training that your new people need, because they don't have the value of, 20 years of experience or having dealt with 200 tenants over, they just don't have that. So whether it's scenario cards, I think role-playing is so embarrassing and stresses me out, and it's so effective. So, I mean, it's one of those things that's just great, because it puts you in the moment, and it shows you how you can walk through those scenarios and start to feel, is the dog that bites going to be a reasonable accommodation, and get familiar with those concepts. So it's the way to go, even if, and if you do it on camera and make your staff watch it later, bonus points. So this is the real next frontier for the staff training. Along with the hostile environment harassment came the quid pro quo harassment. So this, ladies and gentlemen, means that you should not be trading rent for sex, okay? Just put it out there.
Or any other favors.
Any sexual favors, let's not be sexually harassing any of your tenants. I know it's super funny, but this a landlord back east just got hit with $1 million judgment. $890,000 is going to 12 of his female victims, and $110 to the U.S. government for a civil penalty. Everything from just walking in their apartments without notice and propositioning them, and then taking negative, enforcement action against those women who wouldn't be complicit with his desires. All of these things were going on for just way too long, and it's going to be expensive. Not only does he have to pay $1 million, but any rental property in the future that he acquires, he has to hire professional, independent property management. He is basically banned from being a landlord, which is, kind of a big deal, but an interesting resolution to that problem. So, show your staff members the kind of manager you want them to be, and watch over them. Also, keep on the lookout for that kind of weird behavior. Maybe, you have one property manager at, a complex that only has problems with female tenants. well, all his female, they are routinely late on rent, but he's always covering for them. Oh, they're going to get a couple days. I'm going to let them slide, but they don't do the same thing with men. This is, these kinds of scenarios. Just start to watch for that behavior. Check in with your tenants to make sure that that relationship is professional and appropriate, because boy howdy, it will get expensive, and you do not want that reputation. You really don't. All right. I'm assuming that none of you sexually harass your tenants, so we'll move on. All of the policies that you're creating, all of the enforcement actions, the fines, all of these things. I've gone over my time. I'm so sorry.
We're doing well.
Okay. Keep all those records, and like I said, be religious about what records you keep. So you don't necessarily want people's disability-related information, just the same way you don't want their Social Security numbers hanging out in an unlocked file cabinet. Just think about the kind of liability that you're accepting when you keep certain records, but then keep those records of your interactions with tenants. Record the conversations, keep them written down. It'll refresh your memory. It may not always be admissible in court, but sometimes it will be, and sometimes it'll be enough to show a HUD investigator that you really have been following your own policies, dotting your I's, crossing your T's, doing the right thing, and you've just been put in a bad spot. So I think that that's super important. This comic has nothing to do with anything. I just was getting really tired, which explains the next slide. So, lastly, I think it's really important to recognize unconscious bias. And it's not something that you typically will hear a defense attorney saying, except that I've taken the test, the online test of, do I have unconscious bias? And I would have told you, I would have gone to the mat to say I had no bias against anyone ever before I took that test. And I was shocked and I was sad and I needed therapy, which I'm seeking. But the important thing is that we recognize it. We all have it against, anybody that's different from us. And maybe it's a tribal thing, maybe it's evolutionary, you need to, be wary of people who don't look like you, something, but it's there. Your staff people have it, and it's not going to be the same kind of unconscious bias you have. Just be aware of it. When you have the, discretion that you're allowed to, fine some people, not fine others, let people make late payments and not others, this is where that unconscious bias is going to get you into trouble. Use the interactive process. Make sure you're having that dialogue. 9.5 out of 10 times, it will save you from a fair housing complaint if you are engaging with your tenant, letting them know what, obstacles there are and where you're struggling. It really is key. And then you don't almost never need to just right off the cuff give an answer. So if you need 24 hours, you need to consider the situation, review something, talk to somebody more knowledgeable, say that, because when dumb stuff comes out of your mouth and you're repeating it later in front of your attorney and the HUD investigator, we're going, does it violate an ethical rule for me to kick my client under the table right now? Turns out it does. So that's it. I'm over time, but thank you very much.
Is there any other questions?